You are listening to the 4-Phase Cycle Podcast with your hosts, Megan and Alex of Zesty Ginger. If you're looking to naturally balance hormones and learn how to work with your body instead of against it, you have come to the right place. As a duo of an integrative MD and a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, we use the 4 phases of the feminine cycle in combination with functional lab work to transform the lives of the women we work with. Just a quick reminder though, this information is not intended to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. Always consult with your own doctor before making changes. Ready to take control of your health? Let's get started.
Hello there, ladies. This is Dr. Alex here. I am back with the Advanced Podclass series, and I am so excited. So far, we've covered, the way that we create estrogen and progesterone and the normal story that lies behind it, and that really underlies the root of a lot, if not all, hormone imbalances. We also talked about what progesterone means to the brain. And then in the third one, we talked about total DHEA and its marker of adrenal reserves and what that really helps us understand about ourselves and maybe the people that we work with. So for today, we are going to continue that story of DHEA. So if you have, all of these are going to build on top of one another. So I highly recommend going back to listen if you have not already, and kind of getting that foundations. And if you are here and you already listened to it, then you're going to be ready to go to talk about this next thing, which is when we talk about DHEA utilization. All right, so there's DHEA, like we talked about in the last one, and that is a parent hormone, and it's a building block for a lot of different things. That's why we can look at it as adrenal reserves, or really how much fuel is in the tank as far as the adrenals are concerned. And that, again, underlies some of the communication from the brain to the adrenals, right? It's not all just adrenals, because a lot of people are getting adaptogens and things from their providers. But again, we have to ask, why is the brain potentially giving the adrenals that information and that basically instructions? So when we look at DHEA, again, that's raw materials. Then there's another compound that's the activated version of DHEA, and that is called DHEA sulfate. And a lot of times it's just people go by the shorter name, DHEAS. So DHEA, whether we make it or we take it, is a short-acting compound. That's why a lot of times it has a half-life of about 90 minutes, and that's why people with problems that have problems with either making their own DHEA, so they don't have a lot to activate, or they have enough to activate, but they can't carry out that step. A lot of those people have energy regulation problems where their energy levels dip because it's the sulfation, the sticking that S group on there that ultimately makes DHEAS give you that long-acting energy throughout the day that's actually sustained, and you don't have that dip in the energy in the middle of the day, or that cravings for salty or sugary or whatever it is that we generally have cravings for, or if it's caffeine, that kind of thing is impacted in a positive way when our conversion from DHEA, which is a parent compound, happens normally over to DHEAS. Now, here's the deal with that conversion. DHEAS is created by an enzyme. You can think of it as like a little worker guy that has to stick the sulfate group on the DHEA. So whether we are making enough of it or we are actually taking it, we need that enzyme to work for us to have the effects that we're actually looking for from a DHEAS standpoint. Now, high inflammation can block the enzyme that carries out this step. And so because of that, it really tells us about functional inflammation. And the reason I say functional inflammation is because someone can be clinically very, very inflamed. And by clinically, I mean a provider that's looking at you and looking at as an assessment is saying there are clinical signs of inflammation, but your enzymes can be still hanging in there. Or someone can have not very much clinical inflammation and their enzymes are already being impacted. So a lot of that has to do with genetics, it has to do with our setup, it has to do with epigenetics getting expressed, it has to do with our nutrient status. All of that goes into play, but essentially, at least on the Dutch, the conversion from DHEAA to DHEAS is really telling us about that functional status. So it's always the combination of, are there clinical and physical signs of inflammation? And then what do the actual numbers and the enzymatic activity show? So that is a really helpful thing. Now, it is important to remember for providers that this enzymatic step happens in the peripheral body, as in not inside the central nervous system and that entire system. So that helps us localize to peripheral inflammation. So because these enzymes are acting peripherally, it's that peripheral inflammation in the body that can inhibit the enzymes from acting. Now, when we have inflammation in the body, either peripheral or systemic, by its very nature, the central nervous system has already decided that inflammation needs to be present. So here's how inflammation works in the body. The central nervous system is ultimately the decision maker for whether we need to get localized inflammation because you got a paper cut, or we need systemic inflammation because we have, for example, a gut pathogen or SIBO, and we need to get all inflamed. So once we see, or at least the way that I look at it, once I see evidence of enough inflammation messing up the enzymatic activity, I go ahead and assume that if peripheral inflammation is present, that means central nervous system inflammation is also present. Now, this is where we end up looping back around to Podclass number 1, where we talked about the cascade from the very top of the system, the hypothalamus, and its communication with the ovaries and making progesterone and estrogen. But you can see here where once again we've looped back to, if there's peripheral inflammation, that means the brain is inflamed. And if the brain is inflamed, that can have ramifications on what the hypothalamus is actually going to do. So again, here, this is where we loop back around. And so let's talk about, options that I like to think about and consider when I'm looking and supporting someone's function here. Now, peripheral inflammation is it responds to a lot more of the common things that you have heard about or think about for inflammation. These are things like ginger and turmeric, or curcumin is the active compound in there, white willow bark tea, tart cherry juice, cryotherapy, and cold exposure. All of these things help change the expression of the inflammatory pathways, and each of them work in a slightly different way. Now, of course, I have named some of the stuff of the whole food variety, but then there are compounds and isolated things that, of course, can be used by practitioners that are a little bit more specific and a little bit more like going in and snipering the exact thing that needs to be done. Now, when it comes to central nervous system inflammation, these compounds are a little bit different. This is when things like cat's claw or CBD oil or even alpha lipoic acid can be used to modulate these things. But again, that has to be done with a provider who understands what they're changing and what they're modulating. But of course, these are the type of things that we can start to incorporate to change what the brain is seeing. Now, the way that I think about central nervous system inflammation and how it corresponds to peripheral inflammation is that the hypothalamus is, imagine them as a person on a phone, and on the other end of the phone is the central nervous system, and the central nervous system has the message that the hypothalamus gets, and then once the hypothalamus gets that message, then it yells instructions across the room to the ovaries, which is another person, and that's like signaling across the body. Now, central nervous system inflammation is kind of like that hypothalamus person is on the phone, they're trying to get a message, but their side of the room, everyone is yelling. So, how successful are they going to be to get the message from the phone and into, to the person that is listening, the hypothalamus? Now, central nervous system inflammation kind of works like the people start yelling, and then they get all the people on the other side of the room riled up, so they're yelling, and now it's even harder for the hypothalamus to yell the instructions across their room, even if they got it. So hopefully that helps you kind of understand the relationship between some of these systems, because Megan and I talk a lot about, inflammation in the first half of the cycle, detoxification in the second half of the cycle. But of course, you can start to see why we work on that kind of stuff at that point of the cycle, because it's that setup that will determine how our follicles are developed. And of course, that determines how much progesterone we even have. So all of this ends up being super duper important for how we feel on a daily basis. And this is where I think a lot of the adrenal protocols that are done, where it's just looking at the adrenal health, trying to get that DHEA up or replacing it, is just not really enough of the coverage of systems, in my opinion, to really help a lot of people in the place where they are. Now, for some people, just some adrenal adaptogens work wonders and their imbalances are slight. But of course, you can see why in someone who has a lot of these systems imbalanced and looped in, a lot of times it's working on all of these things and fine-tuning everything so that the body is happier doing what it's doing. All right, so that is about inflammation and DHEA for today, but we are going to go on and talk about androgens next, so yay!
Thanks for stopping by for this Podclass. Head on over to Instagram to hang out with us at zesty_ginger, or go to zestyginger.com to get in touch with us. Until next time.